All right, welcome everybody. We're here today for Communication 101 for school mental health, engaging adults on campus who do not have a mental health background. This is part of our series on communicating about school mental health. It's one of the resources that we're bringing to you to help you connect to a variety of audiences and engage them on the topic of school mental health and student wellness. We are really pleased to be here today, and we're grateful to our funder, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, and they are funding us through the Southeast MHTTC, that's the Southeast Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, located at Emory University at the Rollins School of Public Health, and I'm here with my team today from Emory University. We're so grateful to SAMHSA for funding us to bring these no-cost training and learning opportunities to you. You can find a great deal of our existing resources, archived trainings, webinars, toolkits, other papers that are available to you on the website. You can check that out at southeastmhttc.org. You can also find information about our upcoming trainings, and we do have additional trainings on in the same series on the topic of communicating about school mental health. We'll be sharing an upcoming opportunity to learn about a new graphic tool that illustrates the role of teachers in student mental health, in school mental health. And so we want to make sure that you go to the website and check out the archives, check out the resources, and check out the upcoming opportunities. Again, this is all compliments of our funder, SAMHSA. Today, we get to be here to focus on a key aspect of our work, which is making sure that folks who don't know about school mental health build some awareness about it. And when we were listening to what are the needs and priorities in the Southeast region, one of the things that came up again and again was this idea of how do we talk to individuals without a school mental health background about school mental health. And in our work, this is a conundrum that we face quite often because as mental health professionals, we're working in a context that is not necessarily a mental health setting. We're working in the context of education. And so a lot of our partners, our teammates, our champions, our colleagues are coming to the table with an education background and not a mental health background, not even necessarily a child development background. And so today what we want to make sure is that we are looking at what are the effective strategies for conveying some key information about this complex topic of children's mental health. And in preparation for this session, I have to say, it was really, I continue to learn and grow in this area. I'm a passionate champion for school mental health, and oftentimes I get overexcited and over-explain what's happening when we're talking about school mental health. And so using the tools that I'm sharing with you today, it's really helped me refine my messaging and really helped me kind of drill down into what I know is going to effectively change awareness, change attitudes, change norms, and hopefully change behaviors. So that's what we'll be talking about today. I'll be providing with some concrete tools that you can use in your communication, whether that's just kind of casual messaging or whether you're building out a communication plan. And I'm pulling together research from a variety of places. I'm going to talk to you about that in a little while. But the first thing I wanted you all to think about is, how do you change someone's mind about something they believe in? And that's something that we kind of face often. A lot of times people do have an opinion about whether mental health belongs in schools, or they have particular information or lack of information that might inform their opinion about the projects that we're doing in schools. And so, of course, right away, we get to the heart of it. We know that school mental health matters. We're oftentimes the cheerleaders and the passionate advocates for making sure that school mental health is done well, is done effectively for our students. But how do you change people's mind? And so before we get into kind of the work that we do around school mental health, I wanted to just drill down to things that we can all relate to, okay? So wait for it. These are topics that I came up with that oftentimes have very polarizing responses. So if you think about any of these topics, the best way to eat an Oreo, what your favorite kind of pizza is, or if there's a right way or a wrong way to fill the dishwasher, These are fairly politically neutral, but in some households, in some social settings, can create quite a heated debate. And so while they're kind of silly, although there definitely is a right answer for the best kind of pizza, while they're kind of silly, what I wanted you to do is just kind of think through the kind of culture that you come from, the experiences that you have, the mindset that you bring to the table when you're deciding, are you going to eat that Oreo sandwich style, or are you going to break it open and eat the filling first? So again, not these pivotal topics, but things that we might have strong feelings about anchor us in this sense of how entrenched our beliefs and our values can be, why we have those beliefs and values, and how hard it might be to change our mind and fill the dishwasher a different way. So I wanted to just make sure that we spend some time grounding ourselves in the fact that changing people's minds, bringing new information to adults can oftentimes be difficult. And so we want to make sure that we're coming to that conversation fully prepared with tools that we know are going to be effective. And I want to talk a little bit more about what those tools are. So first and foremost, I wanted to share with you this idea of children's mental health. So this slide is not mine. I'm borrowing it from the Frameworks Institute. And what the Frameworks Institute has done for us, and I'm so appreciative of what they've done for us in our school mental health field, is that they have actually gone out and done the market research. They have gone out and worked with Stanford University for a couple of years between 2008 and 2010 to really assess what is it that the general public thinks about children's mental health. And these are some of the things that they found in their research. And as you can see, as you're looking through this swamp of children's mental health, there's a lot of contradictory ideas out there that people hold. There's some misinformation out there. There's some myths out there. And so, just getting a basic understanding of what are we up against when we are bringing awareness to the topic of children's mental health and children's mental health in schools, you can see that we have some mind changing that might need to happen. And so again, deep appreciation to the Frameworks Institute, because they didn't leave it there. They weren't like, hey, here's what you're up against, good luck. No, they did extended multi-method, multidisciplinary research to come up with some empirically tested approaches to effectively communicating about mental health, specifically about children's mental health. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The tools that they have arrived at as most likely to shift attitudes and norms and to bring correct, accurate information to folks who might not have an understanding of children's mental health. And the value in doing this is that we know from communication research that there can oftentimes be a gap between understanding and then what the reality of the situation is. And if we don't build a bridge between what someone believes across that gap to kind of what is the information we want them to have, we can't expect them to change. And so really that's what we're doing here today, is that we're doing some bridge building. When we think about a communication bridge, there are basically 4 steps, and we'll go through all 4 steps together. We talk about at phase 1, really anchoring or putting the foundation of that bridge in the identification of shared values. What's our common denominator belief system? The next step, once we have that foundational piece there, is to clarify what the core issue is. The next step is to offer a simple concept to make a complex issue concrete. And for children's mental health, that's the one that gets me every time. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, but just know that, child development, mental health, child development in the context of mental health within an education system is a very complex, it's a very complex concept. And so what we're going to talk about in our communication bridging today is how do we drill that down to something concrete and simple so that we can most effectively communicate. And then finally, the last piece of our bridge building is around the solutions, right? So really making sure that we're presenting specific opportunities, concrete opportunities for change. What are solutions that we can offer to address this core issue? So that's the template that we're going to follow today. Those are the 4 steps that we're working with. And this is how I've organized it for you. So again, kind of a 1, 2, 3, 4 step, and we're going to walk through concrete examples of each one. And I've put this template together for you, again, with the idea of responding to your interests, your priorities for making sure your messaging about school mental health is effective. That said, this template can apply to any range of topics when you're thinking about changing attitudes, changing knowledge, changing awareness. So why don't we go ahead and jump in? We are going to bring in not only the Frameworks Institute research, but I paired their research with some research from other folks that I found had done incredible work researching how to influence people. This comes from Cook and Lewandowski's research in 2011. And they were really using this for kind of marketing and political purposes, but a lot of the core principles from the studies that they conducted apply to the work that we're doing. And it applies to this kind of overlays to this communication bridge work that we're going to talk through today. And their recommendations for effectively influencing how people think about a topic are to make sure that you're drilling into core facts and whenever possible, using graphics to display that information. Right? So using visual aids, using graphic illustration to communicate a point about core facts. So I think the most common way that we see this pop up, and I see it more and more these days, is around infographics. And we consume a lot of our information visually these days, not just through text, but through images that we get on social media, Instagram, Twitter, that sort of thing. And so making sure that we are pulling on that as much as possible as one of our communication strategies. And I just want to highlight this ties into one of the other trainings, one of the other resources we've developed as part of this series, which is that graphic tool for communicating to teachers about school mental health. I mentioned that to you a little bit earlier. I'll mention it to you again. The other information that we pull on from Cook and Lewandowski's research has to do with how to change or influence people's minds, especially when they have misinformation or holding myths about a certain topic. So in this case, school mental health. And so a lot of times, one of the risk factors is that we are creating a more familiar sense of misinformation by continuing to repeat misinformation. And so their recommendation when we're changing minds is to very explicitly label something as misinformation or as a myth as you're presenting it. So if you want to correct someone and say, actually, the best pizza isn't Chicago style pizza, it's New York style pizza, you'd want to label that with a specific warning that says, it's a myth that Chicago style pizza is the best. It really is the New York style pizza. And that's where we get to alternative explanations. So anytime we are debunking a myth or correcting misinformation, we don't want to just label it as such. We want to replace it with the accurate information. And so that's the alternative explanations that Cook and Lewandowski land on, which is anytime you're taking away a misunderstanding, you want to replace it with the correct understanding or the understanding that you want folks to have. So again, we're marrying together two bodies of research here. The Frameworks Institute, again, amazing work, and you'll find in the chat box, you'll find the link to their website that has all of the tools that came out of this amazing research that they did, and we're presenting their content today with their permission. We're marrying that with some of the key findings from the Cook and Lewandowski, how to influence people on specific topics. And so again, combining those two things, we're going to go ahead and walk through how do we build this communication bridge to make sure that folks who don't have a mental health background understand what we're talking about when we're talking about school mental health. And so, as I mentioned, the very first thing that we want to do, and this is I love this practice, is that we want to identify what our shared values are. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to ask you to put in the chat, what do we agree that we all want for our students? Okay, so just take a moment and go ahead and pop that in the chat. And think about, what do we agree that we all want for our kids, for our students, for our schools? What is it that we want for young people? And as we're defining that, we can see in the chat, things are popping up along the lines of safety, resiliency. We want them to do well. We want them to graduate. So we're seeing all of these examples that people are sharing in terms of what is it that we agree on, right? And so oftentimes this exercise, even though it seems like a no-brainer, is one that we skip over. It's one where it's easy to make assumptions, or we think we're shortcutting or we're fast tracking to get to the result that we want by skipping this step. And this can, as I mentioned before, it's the foundation to the communication bridge. Why? Well, it doesn't really build consensus or strengthen the bridge if we're focusing on what we disagree on, right? But focusing on where there's consensus and taking some of that low-hanging fruit. I mean, the majority of people in schools, adults in schools, want good things for those students. That's why they're there. And so figuring out what are those good things that we all agree on we want for our students often fall into kind of, and I'm seeing all of these great examples in the chat, and they're all true, and they all can kind of fall into these two main buckets, right? When we think about what we all want for our students, what do we agree on? We want them to do well, we want them to be safe, and we want them to be healthy. Okay. And so just because we very frequently end up in the same place, right, in these two categories of we want them to do well, we want them to be safe and healthy, doesn't mean we skip the step, because it's a powerful practice to collectively identify that we have these common denominator beliefs and values for our young people. So start your bridge there at that level 1. And when we would look back at what the Frameworks Institute found in their research, this lines up with exactly what you were just sharing in the chat. And so I wanted to just give you some extra content to pull from as you're thinking about how to do this practice with your community, with your audiences that you want to communicate with. And in this text box on the right here, you can see that the value of prosperity suggests that what is at stake is the nation's future prosperity and well-being. And it proved to be the most powerful overall in shifting American support for policies that promote children's mental health. So this takes some of our kind of day-to-day thinking about like, hey, we want good things for these kids, we want them to do well, and pairs it with this kind of more abstract concept that Americans believe in prosperity, and they know that the children are our future. And so making sure children do well is a way of investing in our collective future in prosperity. And then the other piece that I wanted to just share from you as kind of extra content from the Frameworks values bridges is what to leave out. So remember, they tested all of this information. They not only solicited what folks believe or understand about children's mental health and what effectively builds consensus in terms of shared values, but they also identified some things that are distracting or disruptive to building that communication bridge. And so based on their research, their key recommendations appear at the bottom of the slide here. They suggest that you leave out of your communication any focus on disparities or particularly vulnerable children who deserve more than other children. And this might fly in the face of some of the practices we use most often, which are anecdotes, or because of funding parameters, the tendency to highlight vulnerabilities, to highlight needs. And so again, that has its purpose. But in this particular communication strategy, this particular communication plan about engaging audiences who don't have a children's mental health background, we want to make sure that we're not focusing on language that highlights those vulnerabilities, but is a more collective value that we want all children to do well. And the last piece I'll highlight for you before we move on is this finding that any language around prevention or crisis is a deterrent in building those shared values. So again, focus on the common denominator. We want all kids to do well, and we want all kids to be safe and healthy. So I just wanted that to set in before we move on to level 2. Again, we're building our first phase of the communication bridge, shared values. And most often, again, you want to go through this practice with your community, with your audience, but most often you're going to land somewhere in this zone of we want our students to do well and we want them to be safe and healthy. But let's see where we go from here. Let's go on to step 2 and talk about what does it mean when we clarify the issue. And so this comes from this concept of, while we may feel really passionate about children's mental health, it might be something that we've studied for a long time in school, that we've practiced for a long time in our profession, that we have engaged with colleagues about for a long time in this field. For folks who are not as entrenched in it as we are, children's mental health is a fairly complex issue. I mean, children, period, complex, right? Not one of them is the same. And so when we think about our general public, those folks who don't have a mental health background, we want to make sure that we're really that we're really creating a situation where they can latch on to what is it that we're talking about. And so when we talk about clarifying the issue in a communication bridge, what we want to do is make sure that we're keeping it simple, right? So these concepts of what is children's mental health? What is school mental health? Well, let's start with the basics, right? We all have mental health, just like we all have physical health, right? So having mental health isn't condemning you to something negative. It's like, well, we all have moments of joy and elation, peace and serenity. We also all are on that continuum and land in places of frustration and stress and feeling overwhelmed, and our coping mechanisms may not be up to the task that we're facing at hand in terms of our challenges. And so if we look at the mental health continuum the same way that we look at our physical health continuum, it can really help clarify the issue, right? That our young people are experiencing their own mental health, and they're experiencing it in the context of school because that's where they are, just like they're experiencing in the context of home and in community. And so really kind of boiling down and not necessarily going, like Christina would just go off on a soapbox of like clarifying the issue. What do you want me to tell you? Like, I could go on and on about what the issues are around children's mental health, but that's not what's needed here in building this communication bridge. And I want to tie it back in terms of what we need. What I want to do is tie it back to that Cook and Lewandowski recommendation of making sure that we're distilling down the message, and that we're, if whenever possible, that we're presenting it in graphic form. And so what I have here is one example of an infographic about children's mental health in schools. There are so many of these out there, but I want to pause here so that you can just kind of take a review and think about what is it that strikes you about this visual representation. So if we think about step 2 being clarifying the issue, what does this visual help clarify for you? And if you want to add it to the chat, that would be great. What pops out for you in terms of clarifying the issue? So I see some folks typing in the chat. I want to highlight the reason that I picked this graphic, and I actually, you'll be shocked, but I created the pullout. So if you look at the blue box, it's just kind of a zoom in to the bottom left corner of this graphic. And the thing that I love about this is that you don't just have a bunch of like stick figure students who all look the same. What this graphic clarifies for me is if I'm looking out at my classroom and all of these students sitting at their desks, or all of these students in a Zoom box in front of me, that each one of them is doing something different, right? We can see some students with their head down. We can see some students are grumpy. We can see some students are confused. Some students are talking to each other. Some are having a meltdown. And this really clarifies for me, holy cow, if we have all of, if I send my kid to school, it's not just my kid there independent of all the other kids. My kid is mixing into a classroom with all of these other students who are all having their own mental health. Right? And so school mental health all of a sudden becomes really important to me, because I want my young person to go to school in a place that supports everyone's mental health, so that they're having a cohesive and calm and safe experience as they're pursuing their education. So I wanted to just pause here and demonstrate that it's even just the smallest little nuances in a visual graphic that can really clarify what the issue is for the general public, right? For someone who's not coming from a mental health background. The other piece I wanted to stop here to highlight for folks are two things. One is I wanted to let you know that you can find tons of graphics if you just look at school mental health and Google images. for school mental health, it will pop up so many of these different types of infographics. If you want any specific recommendations, you can feel free, and Sarah, maybe you could put your email in the chat for folks. You can email us, and I'm happy to send you a bunch of different examples of different infographics about school mental health that then you can adopt and merge into your step 2 of your communication bridge. The other piece that I wanted to highlight for folks is that our next part of this communication series, so this is our 101, the next part is a standalone. You don't have to have been to this one to go to the next one. But I wanted to highlight that the content of the August 5th session is going to be focused on how do we use graphic tools to communicate about school mental health. And in particular, we're going to be sharing a resource that we designed with input from folks across the Southeast. That's a school mental health graphic tool designed to illustrate for teachers how they fit in to what's happening with school mental health in the classroom and on campus. And so if you're interested in this kind of visual presentation of school mental health and how it plays out in schools, please join us on the August 5th session. We'll be sharing that link at the end of today's session. And I see folks putting their email in the chat, and I'm gonna make sure that Sarah gets that content so that we can go ahead and send folks who want it, the information. I'm seeing, Sarah, I just wanted to note that Cassandra is also requesting the content. So if you could just make a note of that, that'd be great, thank you. All right. So in each case, for each step of our bridge, I'm showing you kind of the high level overview, and then I'm going deep into some of the additional content. Okay, so if you already got what you wanted on how do I establish the issue, cool. But if you wanted a little bit more, if you're like, Christina, I need more options, I wanted to share 4 examples. So these are 4 examples. These are 2 of 4. I'm going to move on to the other 4. That the Frameworks Institute researched and found are short, concise ways of explaining how children develop and where mental health fits into that development. So the first one I really like, on the top here, talks about child development in terms of building a home. So just this idea of building a home, that's really relatable to everyone. This idea that building process begins with laying the foundation and then framing the rooms and the wiring, and that all of these processes have to happen in the right order. So really simple, concise way of establishing the issue of why children's mental health is important. I want to move us forward to the next page. And again, if anybody is interested in these resources, I'm going to share the Frameworks Institute website. So this is all available in the public domain. And you're also welcome to request these slides if you'd like to use them. The next set of content in establishing the issue, and again, any of these messages, any of these 4 messages may be a better fit for the audience that you're engaging, for the community that you're working in. So there really are some choices, so if toxic stress or this work around trauma-informed schools is a priority, this top example is a really concise way to message children's mental health and establish the issue for folks who might not have the full background that you do on child development or the role of children's mental health in child development. So I'm gonna keep moving forward. I know we're covering a lot of content, but I wanted you to know it's all here. We don't have to go, you don't have to absorb all of it today, but I want you to know all of the tools and resources that are available for you to access as you're working on your messaging, as you're working on your communication plans. And so this is going to bring us to level 3. So this is the 3rd step. This is the 3rd step in our communication bridge. And this one is about describing school mental health, right? So as I mentioned, if you're not coming from a mental health background, this idea is really complex, right? And so I want to take a moment and ask folks you don't have to put it in the chat because this could take you all day. But if you had to think about how to describe school mental health in 2 sentences, and I don't mean 2 sentences that, are running on and on and on and on with like, with conjunctions and semicolons and colons and bullet points dropping down from there. I'm just saying, if you had to say, hey, what's school mental health? What are 2 sentences that you would use to respond to someone? It can be really tricky. I know you're trying to word craft it right now in your mind. I'm going to give you an example that comes from my own personal experience. This isn't about, well, it's a little bit about mental health, but tangentially. My dad is a beekeeper. And I don't know if any of you out there do beekeeping, but it is a very complex endeavor. And so when my dad tries to tell me about what's happening with his bees, it takes hours. I mean, he will just go on and on and on because of the nature of bees being so complex. And while I do deeply appreciate the honey, I don't want to know that much about bees. I really don't. Like, give me like top 3 points that I need to know. Like, don't walk in front of the hive because the bees that are guarding the hive might sting you. Okay, got it. That's a key point that I want to know. And so this is what I think about when I'm trying to like keep a lid on it, because I'm passionate about children's mental health, right? And so I could go on and on and on. And then I just think, like, do these people really want to know all the things I have to say about children's mental health? Probably not. Just like I don't want my dad to keep talking to me about all of the intricacies of like the antibiotics and the hives that collapsed and all of the things that happen with the bees. Like, I don't need to know. I just want to know, Dad, is there honey that I can bring home? So when we think about this part of the communication bridge, I feel like for a lot of us, this is where we go down the rabbit hole, where really we can think about how do we simplify this for someone in terms of what they need to know. And this is my favorite part. This is my favorite part of the work that we have from the Frameworks Institute. And so I want to tee you up for it. If you zoned out or you had to like switch screens for a minute, tune back in here, because this is one of, in my opinion, like this is the gem for me in helping craft my communication with folks who don't have a mental health background. So if we think about school mental health, what is it, right? It's the foundation. And what the Frameworks Institute found in their work is that this metaphor has been the most effective in being able to communicate to people about what school mental health is in a way that really lands, that people can really resonate with. And what they use as a metaphor is the table, right? So school mental health or children's mental health is like a table, and the levelness of a table is essential to it being able to function as a table, right? And this is where in your messaging, you can build in all sorts of hilarious examples of unlevel tables and how they do not work as tables. The other piece that this allows for folks to think about is the reason why a table isn't level. Okay, so there could be lots, like think about restaurants you go to where the table is tippy, right? And your coffee keeps spilling, right? What do we do when that's the case? We wad up napkins and try and find like anything we can to create a makeshift shim to put under one of the legs of the table, right? When we think about our own homes that we're in, and we think about the tables in our homes and whether they're level or not, right? We think about camping or picnicking, and we have our little pop-up tables and the things that make the table off-center, right, or level. So we know that it could be the table itself, right? So the table could be a little bit wobbly. We know that it could be the floor or the ground that it's setting on that is not even, and so it's creating some imbalance in the table. And so when we think about using the levelness of a table to describe school mental health as the foundation that's going to make a student able to function, I think there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different directions that we can head with, and people really resonate with it. It's simple, it's something that we all have experience with, and we can really connect it back and use it to frame how we're thinking about the young people that we're supporting. So again, I'm going to just back us up to look at the really kind of distilled down version of our communication bridge. So we're in step 3, we're simplifying a very complex concept without over explaining it, right? So we're not here to teach a seminar course in children's mental health. We're here to answer the simple question, how does school mental health work? Well, school mental health is part of the foundation for helping a young person be able to function, for helping a young person be able to learn the skills that they need to be able to do well, to be safe, and to be healthy, right? To reach those outcomes that we wanted for our young person. So I'm pausing here to let you know that was my big fireworks show, was the levelness of the table. And just like we did in the other two steps, I want to go a little bit deeper. So if you wanted some additional content about what the research shows in terms of this step 3 of simplifying the complex concept so that folks could really get a concrete sense of what we're talking about for school mental health, I did put a really text-heavy slide in for you all who want to go deeper. And so again, this kind of just gives you more content to draw from that the research has shown is effective for communicating these key principles. And so this first one, just for example, some children's brains develop on floors that are level. This is like saying that children have healthy, supportive relationships and access to things like good nutrition and healthcare, right? So we're just kind of connecting the dots back to the table analogy and then how this plays out in real life for young people. I want to take a look at this, this third bullet. This is another one of my favorite parts from this analogy. Tables cannot level themselves. Isn't that an excellent message? When we think about communicating about school mental health, right? And if we think about school mental health as that table, student mental health as that table, tables cannot level themselves. This is a call to action that's kind of embedded in this part of the communication bridge. And so when people are just like, hey, like, get it together, like, bootstrap it, like, you can do this, like, power through, stop being such a baby. It's like, guess what, guys? Like, tables don't level themselves. I mean, I'm sure if you Googled it or if you looked on Amazon, you could find a self-leveling table, but that doesn't serve our analogy here. When we think about using this particular analogy and the idea that tables don't level themselves, it can really help kind of destigmatize and build compassion for this idea that within our schools, we have the opportunity to meet children where they are and help them level their table, right? So that they can function the way they're intended to function. So I know again, I'm just validating your experience. If you're like, Christina, didn't you learn in your communication research not to put so many words on a PowerPoint slide? The answer is yes, I did. And again, the point here is not that I want to read to you what's on the slide or that I'm expecting you all to read word for word everything that's here. The key point in sharing this with you is the idea that there is so much in terms of resources that you can pull from as you're developing your communication plan. And so high level, school mental health is part of the foundation. It's like the levelness of a table. And if you want to go deeper into kind of more articulated messaging that might map onto the different issues, priorities, culture that you have in the community that you're working in, there's more content to pull from. I'm going to spend just a little bit more time talking about this is a step 2 and a step 3 combo, right? Where we're establishing the issue and we're clarifying the concept. And this ties back, if you think about that infographic that I shared earlier. When we're trying to help people understand why we're focusing on school mental health issues, why are we trying to help students level the table, okay? Why in schools? Like, what do schools have to do with this? And that's one of the most common pushbacks that I get from people who don't think, whatever they think about children's mental health, they don't think that schools have anything to do with it, right? Schools should be about academic issues. Well, these are some of the reasons that, again, if we want to establish kind of a quick clarity around the concept, we can identify these areas for them that we know that they're common and that they affect learning, right? So we're asking students to go and participate in their education, but if the table's not level, they might not be able to participate as effectively. We know that stigma and lack of compassion creates barriers to getting help. right? So addressing children's mental health in the context of school can really create new norms for what does it mean to take care of ourselves. We know that teachers and school staff are folks who are right there with students every day and can help remove some of those barriers. And we know that there are proven benefits to addressing student mental health in school. And so again, for folks who are like, what, that's true? Yes, we have the research. The citations are going to appear here at the end of this session. And so I'm not just putting these out there as like, hey, you should say this. What I'm putting it out is like, we have the research that supports these outcomes. I'm going to go ahead and move us forward. Let's see. Oh, the other key thing I want to say about this is that we have some really good infographics that share these exact words, but in infographic format. So Cook and Lewandowski would be so excited for us. I'm going to go ahead and move us forward to our last part of the bridge. So in step 4 of our communication bridge building, we want to specify solutions. So I'm going to say it again because that's a big one, and then we're going to unpack it a little. So in step 4 of the bridge, we want to specify solutions. So if we've established the issue of, children experience mental health, we all experience mental health, and we want to simplify that concept and say they're like a table, right? And tables don't level themselves. Well, now we have to come up with solutions for leveling that table, right? So now we're coming up in this step, we're coming up with solutions for how do we address school mental health. And this is where you might be like, whoa, I don't know how we're going to keep this short and sweet because it's so complicated. There's so many things to do. I can't even get through them in the day. That's why I'm so busy. Well, I think I want to share a couple recommendations. So this is our concise view. So in step 4, where we specify solutions, we really want to focus on who's the audience we're communicating to, right? So this is an opportunity to really drill down and think, well, if we're specifying solutions, we want to be mindful of who is it specifically that we're sending this communication to, because that's going to really influence who we have as our solution seekers. And so in this example, we're focused in on teachers, right? Where do teachers fit in to addressing student wellness, to addressing school mental health? And again, tying it back to something concrete and something accessible. We know that teachers and school staff steady the foundation, right? And they can do that in really simple ways, like having predictable routines, we know is a way to steady the foundation and help level the table. And then, of course, I'm sure you have a million ideas for what the solutions could be, but again, we're just going to try and get folks thinking. That's the goal of our communication. And so I want to pause here and I want to share a slide that I use when I'm doing kind of mental health literacy trainings with educators. So in school with folks who don't have a school mental health background. And so this is the slide that I use. I pull this up and I ask the folks in the room who are all educators, administrators, teachers, other school staff. So tell me, what do you do if there's a student who's experiencing an asthma attack? Right? And you have very few people, we talk about, what would you do if there's a student on the playground who falls down and seems like they probably have a sprained ankle, right? They're crying, they're holding their ankle, they try and get up and walk on it, but they're all like limpy and they just fall down again, right? We don't have schools. And when I talk about this, I share, we don't have school staff who would be like, hey, I'm a teacher. I am not, I'm not a doctor. I can't help you with that ankle. Like, we're just going to have to wait for the paramedics to get here. So just hold tight, sit still. I can't do anything about this potential sprained ankle situation. Of course not, right? Well, that's not how we respond to a young person who maybe twisted their foot, right? We know that even though we don't have a medical background, most of us, that there are certain first aid procedures that we can implement to help soothe that young person, to potentially prevent swelling. We might elevate the leg, we might put some ice on it, we might support them so that they can walk in to sit in a nurse's office or sit quietly in the classroom until we figure out, like, what are we going to do about this situation? So again, kind of normalizing this idea that we already have ways that we show up for our students that are outside of their academic needs, that we're already meeting our colleagues in ways that are supportive, but are not necessarily in our job description. And so thinking about how do we normalize addressing school mental health by pointing out the ways that folks already are confident and competent in showing up for one another, whether it's their students or their colleagues, can be a really important way to help them feel ready to start thinking about solutions. And so when we think about, again, how do we set the stage for this? We really want people to tap into this idea that we're not asking them to do one more thing. We're not asking them to stretch outside their comfort zone in terms of taking responsibility. We're asking them, for the most part, to do the things that they're already doing, and have some more awareness for how what they're doing to help students can really help tap into leveling those tables. So I want to pause here to just walk through, again, our template for building that communication bridge, right? So we had 4 steps. We started by identifying our shared values. And again, that's a participatory endeavor, although the research shows us there's some likely outcomes from getting voice on this topic. The next thing is clarifying the issue. So really just kind of short and sweet, establishing some of the basic fundamental facts about the issues of school mental health. For example, we know that our children have mental health, and we know that they're in school. And given those 2 facts, we know that there's an opportunity here. Then there's level 3, Christina's favorite level, because this is where we get to take this really abstract, complex concept of child development, of children's mental health, of wellness, of school mental health, and really just distill it down into something that's tangible that folks can relate to. And that's where I like to introduce that idea of the Frameworks Institute idea of the levelness of the table. And then the last step is the specifying the solutions. And again, in this communication, so there is this opportunity to offer specific recommendations in our communication. The other angle here is to think about how are we eliciting responses and solution seeking from the audience that we're engaging, right? So we know that people know best what it is that they can do to solve the problems that are in front of them. And so if you're looking at a young person and you're saying, hey, this foundation is a little bit rocky, what can we do in the classroom? What can we do on campus? What can we provide in terms of supplemental support to help this young person level their table? You're going to have teachers, you're going to have principals, you're going to have school resource officers who probably have some ideas. And so the idea here is to engender some creative thinking, some sense of, well, where do I intersect with this young person or this group of young people in a way that I can show up and really help with the table leveling. So this is the summarization of everything that we just worked through together. Right? So the left side here shows our 4 steps in our communication bridge building. The center kind of really shows what is the prompt that we're responding to. And then the right side is the very concise summary or kind of landing point for the answer, right? What is it that we're trying to convey to folks? So I want to pause there. We're doing okay on time. I want to pause there. I wanted to let folks know that we do have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about some of the traps and pitfalls and quicksand that we can fall into when it comes to communicating around school mental health. But before we go there, I wanted to just pause and see if we have any comments or questions that it would be useful to review together. Carolyn, I'm going to ping on you first to see what was happening in the chat this last half hour, and anything that you want to highlight for folks as a key question that we could address or a comment that you feel like was really useful to bring to everyone's attention. Oh, and Carolyn, you're muted. And folks, I want to introduce you to Carolyn Spezza. She's my teammate. and really helps me in these endeavors to support the Southeast MHTTC. So thank you for being here, Carolyn, to help out today.
You're welcome. So most of the comments are from people looking forward to utilizing this information. But Cynthia Scott, she made a great point regarding the outpouring of research regarding the interconnection between mental health and physical health, and the value of communicating that not just to teachers, but to students as well.
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn, for highlighting that and for helping track the input from folks. And yeah, I absolutely feel like, you know, every day, talk about, I mean, for someone who's really, and this is, you know, probably similar for all of you, you know, I'm seeing all of the newsletters and I'm getting all of the research alerts and the findings that are coming out that really show the interconnectedness and of mental health to this whole human experience, right? So when we think about whole child and the role that physical health and mental health have going hand in hand, is really transformative. You know, I feel like it's really been a tipping point that's quite rapidly shifting how we frame and how we think about mental health, because we are seeing so much of the physiological connection points, and really kind of this idea that, I don't know, in my community, we talk about health in all policies. And this concept of health in all policies is, you know, huge, because we're recognizing how things that we framed in such siloed ways as, you know, public safety, or, you know, where we paint the crosswalks, or, you know, how we establish access to water, you know, all of these different factors that seem like, well, I didn't study that. No one ever talked about that when I was in graduate school. Like, I don't know what that has to do with children's mental health. You know, as the research is coming out, we're learning so much more about the opportunities to really create environments where humans can thrive. And when we think about the work that we're doing, which is with younger humans, and how they can thrive in schools, really shifting our thoughts about, you know, what does health, including mental health and behavioral health, look like, and how does it manifest, and how is it interconnected, and how could we possibly deal with one without dealing with the whole experience. So thank you for bringing that up. And Carolyn, I hear, oh, sure, I'm going to loop back to you in just a moment, but I wanted to just acknowledge maybe folks are having the same feelings that I had when I found this work by the Frameworks Institute, which was a combination of glee and gratitude. And so I don't want to make you wait any longer. Sarah, I wonder if you could go ahead and put that link in the chat. It links you directly to the Frameworks Institute and the number of resources that they have put into the public domain, including, you know, the content that I shared here today with their permission, but they have so many other supplemental resources on this topic as well as other topics. I wanted to highlight that for folks. Carolyn, what were you going to add?
There's 3 other things that I've seen in the chat box. The first one is the connection between health and wealth. The second, and the connection between the structure within a classroom to mental health. And then finally, the issue with the concept that school mental health is equated with just referring students to mental health professionals.
Sure. Yeah, all really important points, and definitely kind of key aspects of how we navigate this work, right? So as we show up in our communities as champions for school mental health, and we're kind of holding this role, and we are holding this knowledge, and we're holding this expectation that it's going to be valued as a resource, we're often kind of bumping up against these kind of different experiences that don't line up with that, right? And it can feel discouraging at times. It can also feel really frustrating when it feels like our voice isn't heard. And that was kind of the key impetus for for preparing and being able to share this information with you, was just that sense of, hey, the knowledge that I'm holding really has value. It has value to you, the teacher in your classroom. It has value to you, this young person. It has value to the parents and caregivers. More importantly, has value to our entire community. And yet I feel like when I'm speaking, no one hears me. And so it seemed like a really important opportunity to bring to you some of these tools to help alleviate that experience. Some of these tools that I feel so, again, like I said it sort of glibly, but really the glee and the gratitude for the Frameworks Institute for kind of taking this to the next step. And instead of hazarding a guess of like, well, let's just do this really cool social marketing campaign, and like, it looks neat. And so I bet it'll really resonate with people. But instead of kind of doing the guesswork, going into the science and using this multidisciplinary approach to tap into, what is it that's creating barriers to my voice being heard, to my message being received in ways that's likely to change behavior or change attitudes. And so again, kind of there's this instinct, I feel, well, I don't know, I'll speak for myself. I feel the instinct to stick with the routine, right? Like if I've done something, that's the way I want to do it again. And it's been a little bit hard to break out of the mold. And so, I'm proselytizing a little bit, but just kind of recommending that we're rethinking how we're communicating and how we're voicing what we know and the experiences we have and the recommendations that we can make around school mental health, so that it isn't just defaulting to a referral system, but rather kind of running the spectrum of universal level supports and across the board to meeting all students where they are with needing to level their table. So I'm going to pause there, Carolyn, and I wanted to we do have a little bit of time, and I wanted to take another 5 minutes before I go into the last segment of our time together. So we'll probably have about 20 more minutes together. I'm going to leave you ample time to take a look at our upcoming opportunities and to help us out by sharing your information with SAMHSA so that we can keep offering these opportunities. But before I do that, I wanted to just see if anybody wanted to take a moment to make some recommendations about what has worked effectively in their communities around communicating about school mental health. Anybody want to unmute themselves and share examples of effective communication strategies that are working in their communities? And that could be, how you engage somebody when you're passing them in the hall, to meeting with leadership, to doing kind of bigger broadcasts on Facebook or Instagram. Anybody want to share examples? All right, that's an open invitation. So if you do, I'm going to move us forward, but I do think the peer-to-peer learning, I see some of it happening in the chat, but I do think the peer-to-peer learning is one of the incredible values that we have in doing these virtual sessions, because we can come together from all over our region and share ideas. So I will elicit one more time before we wrap today. Go ahead and use your icon to raise hand if you have something you want to contribute, or you can go ahead and put it in the chat. So I'm gonna, let's see. I'm framing this for you all because it's a little bit tricky. I like to end on a positive note, but I would be remiss not to share some of the risks and pitfalls that we experience in doing this work. And so I'm going to take a brief detour from our communication bridging to talk about what our pitfalls and traps are in communication, and then we'll loop back to the communication bridge and like land on the high note. So looking at the research, and some of this is from Cook and Lewandowski, other of it is from the Frameworks Institute, but I wanted to just highlight for folks some of the things to look out for. And this helps me personally, as I mentioned, keep a lid on it and avoid making some of the same mistakes again and again. So one of the things that we need to be careful of, depending on the communities that we work in, might be some of the myths. So remember back to the beginning of our time together today, I showed you the image of that swamp, right? Of the children's mental health swamp. And within it, there were a lot of myths or misinformation. So for example, the research that has been conducted shows that there's a certain portion of the general public that think that children are too young to have mental health, right? So we don't need to get into, why people may or may not think that. I'm bringing that up as an example that we can use here to avoid the traps and backfires. And so it's that reinforced familiarity, right? So when we start talking too much about the misinformation, that just reinforces the myth. And so as we saw in the beginning, we know that if we are talking about something because we need to debunk the myth, we need to really clearly label that this is a myth, or I'm about to share new information that's going to change an old point of view. And then we also need to make sure, in addition to labeling it, that we're replacing it with an alternative explanation that's grounded in that information that's accurate, that ties into the communication bridge that we talked about. The other thing that I wanted to, this was a game changer for me in many of my relationships. I want to jump down to the worldview backfire. So this is a trap that is so easy to fall into, even when I'm talking about pizza, right? So it's just this idea that if someone is really fixed in their point of view, and a lot of times this can come from, how the culture that you were raised in, it ties into personal values of loyalty or integrity, kind of other aspects of their sense of self, right? If you challenge their view and it's stemming from something that's deeply rooted, counter arguments are not going to help you. In fact, they could have the opposite effect and create an experience where someone's even more deeply entrenched in their original point of view. And so this is that common situation that I see play out all the time, right? Where it's like New York pizza, Chicago pizza, like we could go back and forth and just keep telling each other like why each other's pizza is terrible and why my pizza is the best. And guess what? The person who likes that Chicago style pizza is only going to be more connected to that idea that their pizza is the best. And so I just kind of cut off my nose to spite my face right there. And so taking a step back and kind of using what we talked about in our communication bridging, this idea of what is the shared value, right? Eating pizza, like that is a shared value. We can both agree that eating pizza is fabulous. It's delicious. I love it. It's indulgent. All of the reasons why eating pizza is great. And so finding that common denominator is a way of avoiding that worldview backfire. So I just wanted to make sure that folks know that a lot of the behaviors that we kind of use as knee-jerk reactions or kind of standard operating procedure can actually set us further back than if we hadn't engaged at all. And so just being mindful and kind of thinking about how do we practice a new skill set? How do we practice a new skill set in a way that's going to help us break from routine, break from the norm, and establish new ways to connect through communication? This next piece that I wanted to share are the what not to do's. Okay, so these are a list of 5 things not to do based on what the Frameworks Institute identified in their empirical research. Okay, so these, again, so the recommendations are tying directly back to the research, because what they found in the research is this does not help you achieve the intention of your communication. So some of these examples are to begin the conversation with the terms mental health or mental illness, right? So not starting from languaging using those terms, making sure that we're avoiding falling into the fatalism trap. So for instance, this idea that mental illness is primarily caused by genetics, or that development of a child is set for life by age 3 or 4. So making sure that we don't fall into that conversational loop right? Again, kind of going back to what we saw in Cook and Lewandowski, that if we just get into these arguments of like back and forth, like, well, you believe that, but I'm telling you it's not true. Here's 4 facts to support my opinion and counter your opinion. That's where we're getting into that, that worldview backfire rut. And we want to avoid that rut by using the communication bridge steps. We also want to avoid the mentalism trap. So this idea that an individual has responsibility or control over their emotional health and well-being, right? So again, we're not arguing whether this is the case or not the case. We're arguing, or what we're positing here is that this is not useful. This is not a useful communication strategy. And so that's the point of these disconnects, is to achieve an effective communication strategy. And again, kind of using the communication bridge to move us forward instead of getting stuck into these ruts. And then these last 2 are pretty straightforward. So we want to avoid making sure that we don't assume that everybody understands the complexity of child development. That's what number 4 is really getting at, right? And so when we were establishing the issue in step number 2 of our communication bridge, we didn't go into a whole long description of child development, right? We used a couple of those analogies. If you recall on that text-heavy slide, one of the recommended was talking about building a house, and how building a house in the appropriate sequence is really important. Otherwise, your house isn't going to be very functional. So that's just one example. And then this last piece, number 5, goes into kind of what we were talking about before, about not using the terms crisis or prevention, or using this idea that like there are these particularly vulnerable students or young people, but rather kind of tapping into our universal and collective agreement for what we want for all children, right? So that's what to do instead of really just highlighting these particular anecdotes or particularly kind of emotionally laden situations. And again, what we're arguing for here, what we're putting forward here, is what the research shows is effective in achieving the intent of your communication. So any of the content here may be true, may work in a context outside of what we're talking about in today's session. But for the purposes of today's session, these are the recommended not to-dos when it comes to achieving effective communication with folks who don't have a mental health background. So I want to just drop back, and we're switching gears and moving out of the like, no, don't do that phase of things, and lapping to our communication template for school mental health. Right? So looping back to our 4-part bridge building that is designed to really make sure the communication that we want to have is going to land in the way that we want it to land, so that our voice is heard instead of our voice being unheard. And so what I want to ask for folks to think about is, who do you need to have these communications with, right? So when you think about who is my priority person or my priority group that I really want to make sure my communication around school mental health lands with, right? Think about who that is. And if folks are open to it, go ahead and put in the chat. Who's your priority population? Who's your priority folks that you want to engage and make sure they can hear your voice when you're talking about school mental health? All right. So I'm seeing some folks add, and we have folks who are in different kinds of roles here, right? So we have board of supervisors, we have leadership in the form of principals and other administrators, parents, caregivers, school resource officers. So one of the things that I want to highlight is that each of these groups are very different kinds of folks, right? And so when you think about building your bridge, if I'm building a bridge to a teacher, that bridge might have some overlap. It might look a little bit like the bridge that I'm building to my principal. But I can tell you that my bridge to my teacher is going to look very different than my bridge to my board of supervisors or to my county office of education. And so I want to just take a moment and encourage you. We provided this template with the 4 steps, and I wanted to indicate that it's a template that you would then apply to each audience that you intend to connect with. So whether these are coalitions or community partners, whether these are funders, whether these are parents, that the template that you would kind of complete for each one as you're planning that engagement would be customized. And we really want to think, for example, if we're talking about the shared values piece, step number 1, the key thing I want to put out there for you is that, yes, the research shows us that we're really likely to land in, a few buckets, right? There's a few buckets, common denominator buckets, like we want kids to be safe and healthy. We want them to do well. We want them to thrive. So we have these kind of buckets that we could estimate we're going to land in. But it's not just the buckets where we land, it's the journey for how we get there, right? When we're building that step of the bridge, that participatory aspect of just inquiring, what is it, what outcomes do you want for students? What outcomes do you want for our school? And so that participatory process in building that bridge together in itself has value, right? Where you land, right, is going to help with the moving the communication forward. But the journey to where you land is also going to build that trust and that rapport, help that person feel heard, like, oh, they really understand what matters to me. And what matters to that person is going to be different for an SRO versus a vice principal versus a teacher versus a caregiver versus your student, your school health officer versus your after school coordinator. And so taking a moment to use that bridge building and kind of think through what it might look like for any of these stakeholders is really going to benefit the outcome that you're trying to achieve with the communication. All right, so we're getting close to time. Tara, before we go ahead and put I don't want to talk quite yet about the survey, but I did want to talk about additional opportunities to deepen our learning. And so I wonder if you could go ahead and put in the chat the upcoming events that I had mentioned to you. And what I wanted to highlight for folks again is that August 5th session. In case you have folks that you want to recommend it to, you don't have to have participated in today's session. This 101 is a standalone. It kind of sets the stage for what we're talking about when we're talking about communicating about student mental health, school mental health. And we have another component to the series. So that goes deeper into using visuals and graphic designs to communicate about school mental health. And we're going to talk about, on the August 5th session, we're going to talk about that in general. And I'm going to offer you a resource compendium that has, I don't know, maybe like 15 different graphics that show what is school mental health as a kind of system or a framework. And so that might be handy for you. And then the other component of the session on August 5th is going to drill down into this amazing tool that we designed with input from folks across the 8 states in the Southeast who said we really need to make sure that teachers understand 2 things. One is that they have a role in school mental health, and 2, that they're not alone in their role in school mental health. And so we designed this graphic tool with input from folks across the Southeast region and are going to present it to you as part of a toolkit so that you'll have this tool that you can integrate into your staff meetings, into your back to school days as a handout. And so, it's going to be available in multiple formats on the resource page, but we're going to launch it and talk about how to implement it on August 5th. So I wanted to highlight that opportunity for you, as well as a separate training series that we're doing. If you haven't heard about it already, it is our self-care series. So it's our wellness series for folks doing school mental health in schools. So it's designed for school counselors, school resource officers, principals, administrators, program coordinators, teachers, any staff on school on school grounds, any folks in education or partners in the community supporting students. Carolyn and I designed this 3-part series that I'm so excited about. And so you'll see that registration as well in the link. And our next session is going to be on July 28th. And that is a session where Carolyn and I are going to be reviewing 7 science-based self-care strategies that you can use right away just to help you kind of balance, restore, and carry forward the good work that's happening. So I wanted to highlight those opportunities for you today. I wanted to invite you to reflect on kind of what is it that you're walking out of here with today. So you came to this session, presumably you were like, I need someone to help figure out, like, how can my voice be heard? And so I noticed that a number of you are looking at some of the resources and tools, but I'd be so interested to hear kind of what surprised you. What is something that you forgot that you remembered? What's a plan that you're going to make to use any of the content that we covered today? So if you want to take a moment and go ahead and put that in the chat, that'll kind of help us drill into the pieces that resonated most with you. And I'm gonna, as you're doing that, I'm gonna make sure that everybody knows where the like deep dive is of this really great content. So as I mentioned earlier in today's session, I borrowed with permission from 2 different bodies of research and married them together in today's session because it just seemed like they were such a good fit. So one of them is on the research on influencing people's opinions, and that's the Debunking Handbook, research by Cook and Lewandowski. And then the second key piece is the Frameworks Institute, talking about children's mental health. And the links are going to be, the links in the chat for the Frameworks Institute content. And I know a number of you requested those resources that will be available. But again, really, just really transformed how I communicate about mental health. I'm seeing some really great examples, things that people are using as takeaways. My favorite one so far is that I forgot that everyone had mental health. And I love that. I mean, some days I'm so deep in it, like that's how I feel as well. And so I wanted to just land on this page. As I mentioned, this is going to be our August 5th session. And this is a little sneak peek. It gets deeper. I didn't want to give all the goods away, but these are some sneak peeks into the tool that we created for you folks that we'll be sharing on August 5th. And now I'm going to go back to that favor. Remember, I told you that there was a favor that I was going to be asking. And so this is the time. Sarah's going to put in the chat a link to a very brief survey. For those of you who've done our Southeast MHTTC sessions before, this is the time where you fill out a quick survey. It gives us the opportunity to share data back with SAMHSA that makes the case for why we need to continue offering these services. And so 2 things. Again, the more of you who can respond to this, the more powerful a case that we can make for SAMHSA to continue offering this funding so that we can offer free resources and learning opportunities to you all. And then if you do have an extra minute, so there's a link that will appear at the end of that SAMHSA survey that allows you to provide specific feedback on today's session. And we are continuing to learn and refine with your feedback. And so if you feel like you have suggestions for how we could do this better or different or continue doing certain aspects of it that really worked for you, we encourage you to take an extra moment to click on that second link and complete the feedback survey that will go directly to the Southeast MHTTC. And so that's we're leaving you with extra time in your day to go ahead and look at all of the resources. So just as a quick recap, number 1, please complete that survey. It's GPRA survey, the GPRA survey. So if you have 9 minutes back in your day, please use 2 of them to complete that survey. We also encourage you to go ahead and sign up for our next sessions. So our Thursday, August 5th session is part of our communication series. But as I mentioned, Carolyn and I are going to be co-presenting on both July 28th and on August 11th with regard to creating cultures of wellness for school staff. And so we'd love to see you on the 28th and help boost your own sense of wellness through use of these effective and proven self-care strategies. And so, yeah, so tasks are get for a survey, please, 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 register for some events. And again, if there are ways that we can continue to support you or link you to any of these resources, feel free to let us know in the chat. We're gonna conclude for today. Sarah, I think we can end recording, and we're gonna go ahead and leave the screen up for folks who